When big weather events occur, meteorologists are tasked with communicating vital information that can help protect lives and property. But what happens when meteorologists go beyond just reporting the weather to discuss something as polarizing as climate change?
And as we get into spring, while the impacts of climate change certainly having an impact here due chiefly to all the carbon emission that has been going up into the atmosphere.
Sometimes it results in a more informed viewer. Sometimes the result is a citizen taking action in their community. But sometimes it can end with a meteorologist fearing for their life.
At the end of the day, there were a lot of people that were appreciative of it, but it ended with essentially a death threat that I received and a series of harassing emails from the same individual.
Today, we are going off the radar and talking to a former TV meteorologist who made a point to talk about climate change during his on-air weathercast. It was a move that provoked intense backlash, including death threats, that ultimately led to his departure from his job. Chris Gloninger will share his experience communicating the realities of climate change, the hurdles he faced, and why he believes meteorologists have a responsibility to broach this topic, even if it's controversial.
You really should be comfortable enough to talk about climate change. And if you're not, then that's part of your responsibility in your role to educate yourself on climate change.
We'll dive into the challenges of climate communication, getting past the polarization, and explore more effective ways to share science in a way that resonates. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much, much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Hello, Emily Gracie here, your host of Off the Radar. This week's episode, we're talking all about climate change communication. You may have noticed in recent years that some meteorologists on air have been talking more and more about climate change in their weathercasts, in addition to that forecast. And that's a trend we've seen lately. A lot of that has to do with Climate Central, a nonprofit organization that helps meteorologists know how to do this communicating. They provide them with the tools, the education, the information to communicate climate change stories and information directly into those weathercasts. And that's exactly how I met Chris, the meteorologist that I'm going to interview today. Chris is a certified broadcast meteorologist, although he doesn't work in TV anymore. He's also a certified consulting meteorologist. Both of these are honors through the American Meteorological Society. And just about a year ago, Chris left his job in Iowa as a chief meteorologist. The reason being, he was talking about climate change on air and he started getting death threats because of it. So today I'm going to talk to Chris a little bit about that. We're going to talk about effective climate communication, what works, what doesn't, where the future of TV weathercasts are going. Great interview, nice guy. He's working now for Woods Hole Group back in Massachusetts as the senior climate scientist. So enjoy my conversation with Chris Gloninger. So, Chris, we go back a little bit ways here. We've known each other for a good amount of time. We served on the broadcast board together, AMS broadcast board, because we're both former broadcast meteorologists doing other things now. So start by telling me a little bit about your background here in your career and where you started.
Yeah. So, like all of us, pretty much, you can say we had that dream since we were young. And for me, it was Hurricane Bob in 1991. So that's how I got into meteorology, starting in first or second grade, and then went to college for meteorology, and then got into broadcast and kind of hopped all over from Rochester, my first job. Couple more stops in the Midwest, was in Boston for about 6 years, probably the longest anywhere that I stayed, and then finished my career in TV in Iowa for 2 years as chief meteorologist.
Okay, so let's talk about what you did when you were a broadcast meteorologist, because I think you and I kind of ran into each other at conferences over the years, and some of those conferences started to transition in the past decade or so into climate education conferences. So we started incorporating more climate information and climate change information into daily weathercasts as TV meteorologists. So when did you realize that this was something important to share? When did you start doing that?
For me, I thought was an issue even since college, but I really never started talking about it at great length until my time covering Hurricane Harvey. And I was sent down there for NBC and covered the storm, the aftermath of the storm, about 24 to 48 hours after landfall. But it just rained and rained and rained. And there was over 50 inches of rain. And I said, this isn't really normal. Then I covered a couple more hurricanes after that, one of them being Hurricane Florence, which also dumped a lot of rain. And I said, I have to be doing more. I have to be connecting the dots between these extreme events that produce a ton of rain and how it's affected or tied to climate change, either caused by it or made worse by it. And I thought, as broadcast meteorologists, it's our job to keep the public safe. And during severe weather, that's maybe breaking into programming to talk about a tornado warning, to track a storm. But when it's quiet, especially, it's educating the public about climate change, because that is a huge issue and it's a safety issue for all of us.
So how did you do it? How did you start communicating that information?
I brought it up with station management after my time covering those storms and said, we should be doing more. And how about a weekly series? It was met with skepticism because they said, well, usually we have to have something that can sustain itself for a while if it's a recurring series. An executive producer and I worked on a storyboard, and we soon found it was overwhelming, the amount of content that really could come from covering climate change. We ended up prioritizing some of those elements because there were stories that were pressing in the Boston area. And we told those stories. We did some evergreen stories, which were some, if you're not familiar with the term, if you're listening, stories that are a little bit more organic and not day-turn stories. And we then went back to station management. They said, okay, you've made your case, we can start covering it. And it was several years of weekly series on climate change, covering mitigation, adaptation, renewable energy, the city's goals to get to net zero, and then environmental justice issues and how redlining was still, even though the Fair Housing Act was supposed to kind of erase those so-called lines, Black and brown communities were still being hit first and worst by climate change in many ways. So we covered that story. And then some of the more pressing issues with the rising sea level in the city of Boston. And it landed me a job opportunity in Iowa. My wife's Midwesterner, so we thought it would be a natural move. They wanted somebody to talk about climate change until they didn't.
So you moved to Iowa because of what you were doing with telling climate stories.
The feedback was largely positive in Boston. After all, not to get into the politics, it is a more progressive city, and I think most people know that and understand that and have seen examples of that. And Iowa tends to be more conservative leaning, but it was a part of the country where impacts of climate change were ever present, and it's an important issue since agriculture is such a big part of that economy. So I understood the vision of station management at the time. I still, to this day, applaud them for at least entertaining the idea of covering it. And they saw my work, reached out to me on a cold call and asked if I would be able to be chief, but also kind of build up their climate coverage in that process of being chief. And it was successful. I think, even though it was short-lived, there were a lot of ups and downs. At the end of the day, there were a lot of people that were appreciative of it. But it ended with essentially a death threat that I received and a series of harassing emails from the same individual. And even after police arrested him, it was something that left me and my family concerned and kind of worried and always looking behind our backs. And after a year of going through extensive therapy, I just decided that this wasn't the move for us. And we ultimately left.
Can you kind of take me through how that started, what you were working on, what you were sharing that upset someone so much that they threatened your life?
You have to look at the research of the Yale program on climate change communication, George Mason University, and they have researched public opinion on climate change for many, many years, and they've divided Americans into 6 groups. And it goes from people that are being alarmed by climate change to those that are dismissive. And it's a small percent that are dismissive, under 10%, but those are the people that you really will never sway or engage with. And I knew that going into the move, there'd be more than probably 9 or 10% of people, because it is a little bit more conservative there. So I tried to be creative in finding ways to talk about the issue that people could get on board with. And I used terminology that I think reached across the aisle, so to speak. For example, Iowa was the fourth biggest wind producer in the country. We went from a house that was half the size in Metro West of Boston to a house double the size, and yet our utility costs were half the price, half the cost. And that was because of wind, and wind was so cheap there. So not only that, that's energy independence. And that was a phrase that I used a lot. It's energy independence. You're not having to rely on tensions and conflict in the Middle East and how that affects oil prices, right? This is something that's grown and harvested literally in your backyard. And for farmers, it was supplemental income. If they had a bad season, they'd be able to offset some of those losses with the land leases that the turbines would give them. So talking about that energy independence and the positives and the green jobs that went along with that, that was met with praise, and people appreciated that. Talking about billion-dollar disasters, the frequency occurring every 2.5 weeks, where if you're allowing these disasters to happen, that's fiscally irresponsible. So paying money to mitigate and adapt to climate change is fiscally responsible. Another term that's often used has maybe more of a conservative connection. But there was pushback, and I expected it. But I also showed my work to peers like Jeff Berardelli in Florida, who covers climate change extensively, also in a fairly conservative market. And he had the theory that maybe I was too much, bringing it into weathercasts, and maybe it was too much of an influence in my day-to-day weather. But his findings were, it was pretty much what he was doing in Tampa, I was doing in Des Moines. At the end of the day, I think that people are much more inclined to write in when they disapprove of something or don't like the coverage. If you're out at a restaurant and something goes miserably, you're more inclined to write and complain, or your airline loses your bag, or your flight is canceled, you're going to complain. But how often do you write in when your flight is on time or early and you say thank you to the airline? Hardly ever.
For sure. But there's a difference between complaining about what you're hearing and threatening someone's life. So what did this guy say to you? And then where did it go from there?
It went off the rails quickly. It was just saying that I was a liberal Biden puppet. It was saying things like, I hope you move back east and drown in a glacier. But what concerned police was the email that said, what's your home address? Us conservatives want to give you an Iowa welcome that you'll always remember. Kind of what the blank, derogatory term for liberals, tried to do to Justice Kavanaugh. And why police were concerned by that was the fact that instead of just sending a threat that said, I'm going to kill you, it was laid out, it was explicit, and you could kind of connect the dots between what he was writing and what he was maybe planning to do. And if you don't remember, there was somebody that was arrested near the house of Justice Kavanaugh with zip ties and weapons. Again, that was cause for police to be alarmed. And then they subpoenaed Google, got an address for him, did the phone interview with him, and ultimately arrested him for harassment. And he pled guilty for those charges.
So you've been a broadcaster for a long time. I'm sure this is, not your first time hearing negative feedback from viewers, but possibly the first time you felt like your life was at risk. Can you walk me through what it was like for you to go through that personally?
At the time, and it's wild to think that this has been almost a year, it doesn't feel like it. And the decision, and actually the threat happened a year before that, because it took a year of healing by going to therapy. And when we worked odd hours, and you can relate to this, and anyone that is in broadcast can relate to this, the hours are 9 to 5 typically. And when you have your wife at home and you're not sure if she is safe, if you have an alert that was, with your security cameras that shows that somebody detected on your front camera at 10:30 at night, your mind races, your heart races, and that's a concern. Look, I was in college a firefighter and saw some horrific things during my time doing that. But this is a level of PTSD, and I do use that term because there are triggers that kind of get you into that frame of mind where it races, you can't sleep, you're not yourself. And I was noticing that on TV, that my weathercasts were disjointed and filled with ums and ahs, something that I had never done in 20 years in broadcast. That's ultimately one of the reasons why I decided to leave. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, the lack of station support also weighed on my mental health. While they, in the immediate aftermath of the, if you should call it that, aftermath of the emails, they were afraid of my security. But instead of doubling down on what we were doing for climate change, they told me to stop. Then they asked me to not use the term anymore. And I think when you have all of that coming together, it's hard to overcome. And for me, it helped guide my decision into leaving broadcast. Look, I still think it is so critical that people do it. And I didn't leave because I was scared. I left because I wasn't able to do it more. And I thought I could make a bigger difference if I left that situation, if they weren't going to allow me to communicate about it anymore.
Yeah, clearly you were not deterred because you are still telling climate stories and you're doing it even more. So can you tell me what you're doing now?
Yeah. I saw this need, and it's funny, and this is a lesson maybe for people listening. You never know how an interaction will affect or change your life. And when I was in Boston, I interviewed a consulting firm that was doing probabilistic flood modeling for the city of Boston, and actually for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And unlike FEMA flood maps, unlike your bathtub model approach, which is essentially filling up an area to a certain elevation and seeing what floods and what doesn't flood, there's a lot more that goes into it than that. Well, they developed this model that looked at kind of every detail and gave you a much more clear understanding of the risk, community risk, and it helped prioritize some of those risks and how the Commonwealth could kind of tackle those issues. Well, I covered that during my climate series, and I kept in touch with them. And I saw more of the work that they were doing, and I saw the need for people that could kind of communicate what they were doing. My job is more than just that. I actually am a project manager and work kind of as a resilience planner using my science, my meteorology and climate science background. But I still communicate because there are a lot of engineers who are extremely bright, but maybe don't have the best communication skills.
What?
What?
I know, it's funny. A lot of people don't realize this magical role of the broadcast meteorologist. And I think we know, because we're well aware of our great skills, but it's this merge of science and communication. And those are two fields that are often very separate. So there is this huge need for these educated science communicators like yourself.
There is. And when you're going, and in some cases, it's a high stakes game where you're proposing these plans to towns that essentially vote yes or no on these projects that you can make or break a community. If you're not bringing your A game and can't effectively communicate without just spewing out a whole bunch of jargon, you're not going to win your case. So they saw that need, and I commend them because they see and have the imagination to understand why having an effective communicator is critical in this process in the climate space.
So what's the name of the company you work for now?
So Woods Hole Group, it stemmed from Woods Hole Oceanographic, which many people know just from being a long-standing research institute down in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Two of the scientists spun off into the private sector, wanting to do environmental consulting. They've grown. They were actually bought by CLS, which is part of the French Space Agency, which is really cool. And we're tying some of that satellite technology that they do with telemetry for tracking, which also has a huge impact on climate change and understanding climate change. So it's Woods Hole Group, but now it's under the parent company, which is French, which is CLS.
Okay, so you're kind of focused on flooding right now, but you also have your own company where you're doing consulting. And I saw you have your CCM now, your Certified Consulting Meteorologist seal. It's a multi-sealed. You just need your CDM, and then you've got the trifecta.
The trifecta.
But it's like the weather nerd version of the EGOT, I guess.
Yes.
So I want to talk about climate communication because I think a lot of people, scientists, non-scientists, are scared to talk about climate communication For one, maybe they don't feel educated enough. Maybe they're scared to get into an argument. They're scared of confrontation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, because of what you've been through, on effective climate communication and the best way to go about it in these different scenarios, whether you're a broadcast meteorologist or whether you're, just a concerned citizen.
Emily, you have to know your audience, and you can't talk down to people. You can't sound like you are this expert authority figure, even though you are an expert of the subject matter. People don't like to listen to people that are talking down to them. And you need to find issues that are important to them. And in Iowa, what I did, as I mentioned, finding ways to connect with people that may not be on board with climate change by using terminology that they're familiar with is super helpful. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the political spectrum, conservative side of the spectrum is concerned about what the cost is going to be. Well, renewable energy now is as competitive, if not more competitive, than old school fossil fuel based sources of energy, coal, oil, gas. All right. So that is energy independence. That is cheap energy, right? And then the fiscal responsibility or irresponsibility of allowing disasters to go unchecked. If you're allowing people to rebuild after storms and giving them a blank check to do that, and they're building it in the same footprint as their house was before the storm, that's irresponsible. That's essentially flushing your money down the drain. So those are ways I think that we can connect with people and understand that the cost of this is going to be exorbitant. And if you look at what insurance company is a traditionally conservative industry is doing, they're pulling out of areas that are high risk, or they're increasing the premiums and the costs to their clients. And at the end of the day, we're all paying that price because either our taxes go up because of it, or they're not going to take a loss, the insurance company, so they're going to be charging us more. These are relatable things that gets everyone involved in this conversation, because not everyone lives in Charleston. Not everyone lives in Boston and Miami that see rising sea level and the impacts of it day to day. So they need to know how they're being affected by it day to day. And that is one way, because of the increased cost. The other thing, for example, everyone cooks with olive oil, right? Well, olive oil prices are going through the roof because of what happened and what has happened across parts of Greece, the area where olive oil is largely produced. And because of a mega drought in that part of the world, fueled by climate change, that is what's driving the cost of olive oil up. And I think once people start understanding how it affects their daily lives, that's when you get change, and that's when you make headway in the conversation. For scientists that are listening, find ways to connect it with people. Don't just say X, Y, and Z and throw a bunch of jargon your way, because people are going to tune out. Find ways to make it relatable. And then you'll start to get people to maybe take their guard down a little bit and listen if they're in that doubtful group, that doubtful category. Because at the end of the day, if you look at that research by George Mason and Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, the only part of the population that you really can't make any headway with is that 9% that are dismissive. And that number fluctuates over the last few years. But there's 90% of the people that at least would have the conversation with you. And I think that that's important to understand.
Any suggestions for resources for people who do want to learn a little bit more and don't really know where to turn, or might be intimidated by graphs that they see and big IPCC reports? Any simple websites or apps or resources you can go to get some simple climate information, up-to-date climate information too? It's ever changing.
Yes. I mean, Climate Central is a great resource, not just for broadcasters. I put my graphics in for my presentations from Climate Central because they are amazing at what they do. But there's also a guide that I use now. Is essentially brought up with the do's and don'ts of what resonates with people and what doesn't. So if you're using phrases that alienate people, avoid using them, because you want people to be on board. And at the end of the day, if people don't necessarily believe the science, and I hate using the term believe, we just need people to understand that taking meaningful action is important. It's there's a return on investment in doing that. because really that's all that matters at the end of the day is cutting those emission levels, which eventually will help turn around this vicious cycle that we're in.
Yeah, I get it. There is a lot of extremism out there. And even with the eclipse that just happened, I see so much misinformation out there from, even broadcast meteorologists. So I understand why the community is confused and angered by what is trusted and what's not.
But I also encourage people, speaking of TV meteorologists and the ones that I know will be listening to this, keep doing it. And I think if you are comfortable enough to talk about an eclipse, or if you're comfortable to talk about any of the earthquakes that have happened, volcanoes that have erupted, you really should be comfortable enough to talk about climate change. And if you're not, then that's part of your responsibility in your role to educate yourself on climate change. And you should have the technical background to go through the IPCCs. Maybe your audience won't be doing that, but you can do that and kind of weave in those things into your weathercasts. I think that's important.
It is, and it's the one thing that people can't get on their own. I mean, people can get the 7-day forecast on their own now. They don't need a TV meteorologist to tell them. Even the hour by hour, they can look at models on their phone. But what they can't get is trusted science communication on these subjects that they don't know about.
100%. Exactly. I mean, that is something which I tried to relay to my station management when they pushed back and said, when they were having that conversation with me, don't talk about climate change as much and don't use the phrase climate change. They said, we want stuff that people can't get online and on an app. And I said, well, you're answering your own question. Really, at the end of the day, you're not getting that on the app. You're not getting those Climate Central graphics on your app. You're not getting the number crunching on an app that shows, we're seeing 10 more 90-degree days over the course of the summer. I'm just using some arbitrary number. But that is true, unique, organic stuff that you can produce on TV that keeps you ahead of the app and keeps you ahead of any online forecast services.
Yep. We want to stay relevant, at least for a little while.
Exactly.
Exactly. Chris, is there anything else you want to add?
At the end of the day, if somebody's listening and wants to hear about it in their newscasts, writing in and telling station management, that is true research. And I often question about how this research is conducted. I did ask station management at the time. I said, well, if you ask somebody if they want to know the forecast or hear about climate change, if that's how the question is worded, of course they're going to say they want to hear the forecast. But it's how that research is phrased. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't know how those questions are asked. But I do know that if you write in and encourage station management that they should be having their meteorologists talk about it, it will make a difference. There's no question about it, especially in this day and age when TV stations are needing viewership. They will do anything that they can to keep you tuned in. So I would encourage people to tell them how they feel.
Awesome. Chris, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for what you're doing too, and for sticking it out in this climate change storytelling arena.
Thanks, my friend.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. If you know someone interested in weather and climate, please share this episode with them. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Let us know what you think of the show and give us ideas for future episodes while you're there. A big thanks to Chris Gloniger for sharing his story and his expertise. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.